What's up, gangsters? How about some model making in the time of the coronavirus? Yeah, we all need something to watch while we are stuck inside, right? And that's good because this episode is going to be another one, another long one. But finally getting finished up with this cockpit interior of the Tamiya 148 Spitfire Mark 1. And this episode is going to cover doing the dry brushing for the highlights and installing some seatbelts. So let's get right to it. Okay, so finally back at it with this little Spitfire kit. It's been a while. I'm a little out of practice at talking about this, but I think we'll get through it. So where I left off before was I had some. I had done all of my dull coat on the interior parts here after finishing all the washes, and I had a few goobers to clean up, and I took care of those. I cleaned up my itty-bitty spare light bulbs there. They look a lot better, and since I already had them out from something else, I just used my handy-dandy Model Master enamels to do that, because they also, as I've said before, are a great low-risk way of doing detail painting. I also took care of the place where I had rubbed the paint off of those little gizmos right there on the instrument panel bulkhead. That's all cleaned up, looks good. And so now I'm ready to finally get to some highlighting, which I'm going to do with just a little bit of dry brushing. And this is going to be pretty straightforward because there's honestly not a whole lot in here. In fact, most of it is going to just be done on the parts that are black. I want to do a little bit on this seat, on that brown cushion. That'll look good. And then I'm also going to do a little bit on the edges of the seat. So what I've got out here is some oils that I've selected. And these are, like I said, going to be pretty straightforward. Some titanium white, which is the most opaque of the white oils, and it's great for tinting other colors of oils. I've got this neutral gray, which this is one of my favorite things. When I do highlights on something that's black, I want just a little bit of a highlight. I don't want something real crazy. And also, since I'm super lazy, I don't want to have to mix my own black and white. So this neutral gray is really, really nice for that. And unfortunately, Winsor & Newton doesn't make one, but I found this one by this Michael Harding guy, and it's a very high quality oil, so it's good. Then I've got just this raw umber that I'm going to combine with some white for the highlights on the seat. And then I'm also gonna do the green a little bit, and I'll talk about that in a second, because that's kind of a bonus almost. But I've got this Abteilung 502 faded green that I think I can work with a little bit. So let me just get straight to the business at hand. If I can find a brush, I should have had one out already. Now what I want to use for this is this fantastic Royal and Langnickel number 2 combo. Now I'm not really sure why they call it a combo, but it is, I guess, kind of a hybrid between a filbert and a chisel. You can see that it's kind of got that rounded tip shape that a filbert has, but yet it's flat. So I don't know. Anyway, that's what this one's called. It's called the number 2 soft grip combo, and it's my favorite one for doing a lot of oil work, but especially for doing this dry brushing stuff to make highlights. You know, people talk about dry brushing being an old school technique, and you know, whatever. I think that's pretty silly. It's just another way of oil paint rendering, and it's just another technique that you can use to get the job done that you need to do. So I don't, nobody should be hating on dry brushing. It's very effective, and it's very simple. So what I'm going to do is I want to just get a little bit of this neutral gray on the brush. Doesn't take much because I'm going to get most of it right back off of there. And I'm going to scrub some of it off on this piece of paper. Now some of you may be wondering, why am I not using a piece of cardboard to leach the oils out? That's pretty common when you're using oils for weathering, because you know there's a couple of reasons to leach most of that linseed oil out. They dry a little faster if you do that, and it also makes them dry with a more matte finish. But when I'm actually just going to paint with oils, I don't worry about it too much. And I like to use this. This is extra heavy duty copy paper, or it's also this is brochure paper, and it's like an 18-pound or a 24-pound paper, or maybe a 30-pound paper. And it's nice because it will soak up some of the oils, not quite as fast as cardboard, but because it's white, I can really see the colors really well, and I like that. So at any rate, what I'm going to do now is just get most of that gray off on this rag. And when you have scrubbed enough off of the brush that it seems like there's not any more on it, then that should be about right. It's just, hopefully I can do this without banging into the camera like I always do. But then it's just going to be a matter of very lightly whisking the brush across the high points. And you can see that even though I allegedly got rid of all that paint by wiping it off on that rag, that there is still very much some of that neutral gray oil in there. And it just takes very, very little to get that done. And you can see that as soon as it starts to pick up those raised details, that they just really start to come to life, and they just pop out, and they look cool. So, and that's the whole deal, right? To make this look cool. So I'm going to just catch these little bits on these black boxes here, and that'll be it for this piece. Now, if you accidentally get too much, or you hit something that you didn't really want to hit, not a big deal at all, because with it being oils, it will be super easy to remove the excess with a little bit of mineral spirits and a really small brush. You really can't screw this up. So I'll come back and take another look at that. But that is basically what I want to accomplish. I think I got a little too much on that box in the rear there, because you can't really see any difference between the low part and the high part. But I'll clean that up here in a second. Okay, so the next thing is on this side, same thing. Just a little whiff across there to pick up the high spots. Now, not everybody prefers this look. It is a style. It is, it's an aesthetic choice. And if you don't like it, that's totally cool. I like it because it brings up just a little bit of drama, brings those details out, makes things a little bit more interesting, and you can really kind of tune it to be, exactly as dramatic as you like, but kind of the way I think about it is the way Matt McDougall puts it. It's stage makeup. It's just there to create a little bit more interest and a little bit more drama. So there you can see those pieces pretty easy. And now the instrument panel. And now you can start to see why I like leaving it attached to the sprue so much, because for stuff like this, it's just so much easier to hang on to that way. Now, obviously, that is going to cloud my instrument faces a little bit. And that's okay, because I'm going to just come back and clean that up with a little bit of mineral spirits. So that takes care of those. I think that's just about everything. I want to maybe pick up the detail on this compass. That looks pretty good, just enough to emphasize that round face of the gauge there. Little bit on this gun sight, and obviously this is not going to be super visible with me having the canopy closed, but every little bit helps, and that's part of the reason for doing this, because with everything being so kind of buried down in there and hard to see, every little bit of contrast helps. Okay, so now I want to do a little bit on this seat. Oh, wait. Before I go there, I think I need a little on the headrest and the voltage regulator. There we go, just like that. Okay, now I want to do the seat cushion. So I need some brown, a light brown to do that with, and that's pretty straightforward. I've just got this little piece of photo etch that I've cut to this chisel shape and put into one of these cheap X-Acto handles, and it's a great little paint mixer for working with oils. It's just kind of a little DIY spatula there. Now this is, this is really just purely to taste. Whatever color or tone you think looks good is really what you should use. There is no exact color. And again, if you don't get it the way you like it the first time, you just erase it right off of there. So, and no, I didn't bother cleaning the brush first, because what you don't want to do is get your dry brush wet with mineral spirits, because that'll screw you up. So either get a new brush or just be okay with it like that. That's one thing about oil work. It's good to keep a number of the brushes that you use handy, because you really do need to trade brushes a lot when you're doing a lot of oil work, and it is kind of a hassle to keep track of them and all that. But once you start working with oils a bit, you'll see why that's important. Man, I just keep falling off the camera viewfinder there. Anyway, that's all I'm really looking to do on the seat. Just enough to create a little bit of texture and a little bit of visual interest. And I will allow these to dry overnight. 24 hours is really plenty. And tomorrow I will immediately hit these with dull coat, and then it'll be time to add some seat belts finally. But I want to put a little bit of a highlight around the edge of this seat bucket, and you know, if you wanted to, you could also highlight like these ribs and so forth in the cockpit. Now that gets a little bit trickier though, because you've got to come up with a color that works for that. So what I try to do when I want to do highlights or shadows on a certain color, what I try to do first is match the color itself by blending some oils. Now, RAF interior gray green is pretty much just gray and green, and you can get pretty close to it by grabbing a decent green, and that's what I've used this Abteilung faded green for. I mixed it with a little bit of the neutral gray, and you can see it's not an exact match, obviously, but it's going to be, I think, pretty good. I probably, I don't know, should have mixed in a little bit of brown with that maybe to get it a little closer. We can do that. I can just do that with the brush. But you can see then that what I did after I got a pretty decent tonal value there on the right, that I then lightened it with some of that zinc white. And that'll be pretty close for just picking up the edges of this seat. And I've already got a lot of brown in this brush from what I just did, so it should be pretty good. And the truth is that for such a small amount of paint, that you don't have to be just right on the money. Okay, so there we go. So that picked that up pretty well. Now, it's a little bit more paint on there than I want, because I've just got so much built up on this brush that I'm not really dry brushing anymore. So what I'm going to do then is just grab another brush, and I can get what I want is something that's relatively large and soft compared to what I'm doing. So I'm just going to grab this. This is a Royal, and this is really a pretty big filbert, but it's nice and soft, and it will let me sort of blend that and tone it down a bit by removing. So there we go. A little bit of visual interest on the seat cushion, the headrest, and the edges of the seat bucket itself. Another angle of it there. So not too bad at all. And I think that will be, that's really enough to take care of all that. So we'll come back to it tomorrow. Okay, so back at it the next day, and I have gone ahead and installed the instrument panel and the control column, so you can get a pretty good look at that. And you'll notice a couple of things. One is the dry brushing work that I did, and that I also recovered the contrast on the gauges. And that's two things. One is that, as I mentioned, I used a little bit of mineral spirits to clean the oil paint haze off of those faces. And I was helped in that task with this very cool and very tiny super sharp Q-tip. This is from Tom Annis at annis.com. I think that's right. Anyway, he makes all kinds of cool stuff that I've shown you guys in some of my other videos. But these Q-tips, one of those things that you can't imagine what you'd have a use for until you have a use for it, and this is one of those. Then once I did that, I wanted to sort of demonstrate the look of putting a little bit of gloss on the gauge faces. It's totally overkill for me since I'm going to have the cockpit shut, but again, I want to demonstrate everything here, so I went ahead and did that. And there's a couple of different ways to handle that task. One is what I did, which is a real easy thing of just brushing a little bit of aqua gloss in there, and you can use any clear acrylic gloss. One of the few cases where using Future might actually make sense. But I shouldn't say brush, because this is another one of those situations where you want to have enough of a little droplet on your brush tip that you can basically just deposit it in there and have it flow into that round receptacle and have the ridge of the dial face, basically hold it in the right spot. And that's what I did with the aqua gloss. Now, another option for that is to use a UV glue like Bondic. Now, Bondic is not my favorite for two reasons for this. One is it's pretty expensive, and the other is that it's pretty thick. So I have this UV glue from a company called River Run, and you get it from the fly fishing guys. And for 20 bucks you get a thick and a thin, and you get this dope UV flashlight for curing it, which is great. And I find that the thin stuff is really useful for things like these gauge faces. It's not quite as thin as thin cyanoacrylate, but it's definitely thin enough to use for this type of thing. The one thing you have to remember, though, with using UV glue of any kind for your gauge faces or anything where it's going to end up, having that as the finished surface, is that it requires, it has to be anaerobic to completely cure. What that means is, it's a fancy word for no oxygen. And when you are curing it with the light, the very top surface of it obviously is in contact with the atmosphere. And so it doesn't completely cure, and it'll leave a thin layer that's kind of tacky on the outside surface, and that can catch dust or fingerprints. And so what you do with that is you just wipe it off with a little bit of IPA, and you'll get rid of that sticky layer. So just something to be aware of if you decide to use super glue for your instrument faces. Now, next thing is it's time for seat belts. And I should also note that I have not sprayed any dull coat on any of this stuff. And the reason being is because I'm just not worried about it being durable enough with these oil paints being fully cured, which 24 hours for that tiny amount of oil paint is plenty. And if you don't believe that cured oil paints can be plenty durable, just go to an art museum and go start touching the paintings. And, think about how tough they felt while they were hauling you off to jail. Bottom line is, if it's good enough for the hundreds of year old surface of a painting, it's going to be just fine for something like this as long as it's well cured. So, if you're not worried about having your grubby little hands all over it, then you don't necessarily have to put any further clear coat on top of the oils. So for, something like this, there's just really not any reason to go to that additional step of adding even more clear coat. So those are going to be all good. So now it's time for some seat belts, finally. And what I'm using for this is these Edward pre-painted RAF Sutton harnesses. And I like these the best for 1/48 scale. There's a couple of different options. HGW makes their wonderful cloth paper ones that have individual buckles, but at 1/48 scale, they are super hard to thread. And I just, for me, especially with the canopy closed, don't feel like that the additional realism is really worth the additional effort. But for 1/32 scale, absolutely, that's what I always use. Now, at 1/48 with photo etch, you've got the option of either these pre-painted ones or the unpainted style, and obviously you've got some of those with this kit. And there's kind of pros and cons for each one. The pre-painted ones have the advantage of allowing you to glue them in place while you're still doing the assembly before you paint. And so if you have some issues with excess super glue or whatever, you've got plenty of opportunity to clean that up and make it look neat and tidy before you paint. And then when you paint them, you treat them just like a molded in seat belt. You paint them in place. And they can look great, and you can do a good job with those. And you know, if you've got a little bit of separation between the photo etch belt and the surface of the seat, you shouldn't have too much trouble maintaining a good color separation. And these that come with the Tamiya kit, you know, they look great. So that's an option. But you have, you know, you're going to take a lot of time to paint those. If you're not super confident in your painting skills, or you're like me, you just want to get it done and keep moving, then these pre-painted ones are also excellent because as long as you can handle assembling them after you've done all your painting, then you'll get a really nice, you know, a nice finished product. Now, one thing that some people complain about with these is that when they start bending them, the paint falls off. I personally have not experienced that specific issue, but you know, it seems plausible, and I don't doubt that it could happen. But again, I haven't seen it, so I continue to use these. Now, I have already added the first lap belt to this little seat, so you can kind of see what's going on here. I always start with the side that you can't see in a Spitfire cockpit, and it's a little trickier because you have to poke it through that hole and glue the buckle down. But you can see that I've tried to lay it in there with two strategies in mind. One is to, you know, make it look natural, and the other is to cover up the little glue goober from the extra thin when I assembled the seat. And you can see that I have another really bad one there at the back of the seat, and I didn't see either of those until after I did the paint. And I was kind of hoping that I would cover them up sufficiently with the seat belts. Now, we'll see. But either way, got to assemble this one. Now, these things have a little, they have a second part on the lap belts right there that you're supposed to glue on there. Now, I did that on this one, and as you can see, sitting right there, it did not stay put. I kind of didn't think it would, so I won't be surprised if the other one falls off. But wanted to show you guys this thing that I used when I was gluing it on. This is called a Marvy jewel picker, and I bought this recently. I'd seen people using them and wanted to try them out, and this kind of takes the place of the wax photo etch placement pencil. And that tip right there is a bit sticky, and that's what that's what lets it grab tiny little things, and it does a really good job of it. You can see that. It almost did too good of a job, because when I was trying to glue this in place, I actually had a hard time getting it to stick to the super glue better than it did to this little red tip, and it kept wanting to pull itself off. Now, some people have noticed that these things lose their effectiveness with time. And I'm not surprised by that. Clearly there is something on this tip that makes it a little bit sticky. And I can certainly imagine that if you didn't keep the cap on this thing, that it might not stay sticky. So we'll see. This is something that I'm going to kind of be evaluating and deciding if I want to continue to use. But it does let you do really nice, precise placement. So I don't know if I'm going to bother sticking that little strap back on there or not, because even with the canopy open, they just really don't show very much. And it's always going to be in danger. Sorry, I got to plug the charger in here. It's always going to be in danger of falling off. So I don't know that I'm gonna keep that. But anyway, I am going to go ahead and attach this other belt, and we'll bend it, and I'll do that on camera, and we'll see how it goes. Hopefully I can stay zoomed in and on camera good enough to make this worthwhile. Now I've got just a little bit of puddle of super glue right over there, and I'm using my glue looper, which I love for this type of thing because it lets me have such good control. So I'm just gonna put a little wad of glue right there on that nub where that thing is supposed to go. And the glue looper thing is great. I mean, yeah, you can use the eye of a sewing needle, or you can make your own with a paper clip, or whatever. There's a ton of different ways to do it that are not as expensive as buying a glue looper, but I like them. I love them. And one reason is because I can put them in these cheap X-Acto handles, and then I've got something that gives me a tremendous amount of control. I've kind of lost my little nub of glue right there in the process of warting that around, but that's okay as long as it'll stay put there, because that's all I'm really trying to do with that super glue. That's not enough to be structural, if you want to call it that. Certainly not enough to attempt to now bend it around that seat. For that, I've got some thin super glue right here on top of this little cup, and I'm going to use that to make sure that this thing is secured in place. And I will again use my glue looper to place it. Okay, so here we go. I've got this thing attached on there, and you'll notice, maybe you noticed while I was doing it, that I added some new super glue to the top of this little cap. The reason is because I could tell that it was getting a little bit thick, and when that happens, you have to just stop and get some fresh stuff, because it's got to be liquid enough that it will flow around these little tiny features in order for it to do its job and not make a big mess. And then I used some kicker to make sure that it's nice and hardened. But I've done this before. I know how the script on this goes, and I am not going to depend on that super glue to hold this while I make that bend. Okay, I'm going to use my thumb, and I'm going to hold that. I'm going to hold that in place while I perform that operation, because nothing is more frustrating than trying to wrap a seat belt around a seat base only to have the bottom end of it pop loose, because then they are really hard to glue back in place. Now, I'm sure we're about to see, you can see where that little strap is glued on there. I'm sure we're about to see it pop loose. If it doesn't, I will be extremely surprised. But you can see why I'm so adamant about making sure that that bottom end is not able to come loose, because I'm basically just smashing that down in there, again using this awesome little Q-tip, and I just want to, again, just make sure that it can't come loose. And I cannot believe that that strap is still hanging on there. Look at it, it's just sticking out there, kind of cool looking, so we'll leave it as long as it'll stay there. Now, what I have to do is I have to put a little bit of glue underneath the main part of the belt there, and so again I'm just going to go back to the thick stuff that I have here, which has thickened up a lot just while I've been here working. And what happens when you get this thing clogged up is great. I've got this lighter and just a quick burst of the flamethrower and it's cleaned off. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm not going to torture you guys with watching all this seatbelt process. But this, because it really doesn't get any more interesting than this. But I'm going to go ahead and finish this up, and we'll come back and take a look at it when I'm done. Okay, so it's the next day, and I am not finished. The reason I've stopped is because I feel like it's really important to show this particular part of the process. As you can see, I have a part of the harness attached to that seat. And let me explain. These RAF Sutton harnesses are a little bit complicated. It has a front and a back part. And you can see here with these Edward instructions right there where you attach the back to the front, and that tail right up there by the number 2, okay, they don't do a good job of illustrating this with the Edward instructions. They make it look like it drapes over the back of the seat. That is not correct. You'll notice there's a feature missing in the drawing of the seat there, that being this little hole down there. And that's what's supposed to happen. Looks like I got some hairs on there I got to get rid of. Anyway, the Tamiya instructions are better at explaining how that thing works, okay? You can see here where they have you add the back portion of the harness and the front of the harness together. They separate them a little bit differently, but you can see that tail there where it says 9mm is much better because it's longer and it actually goes down through that hole right there. So it gets a little bit tricky, but it's cool because it kind of gives you a sort of, the harness just naturally is going to kind of curl up right there. So what I chose to do with this Edward thing is I knew how this was going to go because I've done these before. And rather than attaching the two pieces of the harness together and then try and put it on there, what I did is attach the back part to the seat first and then curl it over. And you can see there, one of the issues that I was talking about before of paint peeling up. Now that, it appears, now that I'm looking at it closer, is not the Edward coloring that's peeling off of there, but it's some of the tan acrylic paint that I painted on that thing that dribbled over to the opposite side, because these things only have color on one side, right? If you look here, you can see it's just bare metal on the back side. So in a situation like this where you have to curl it over on itself, you're going to see that wrong color. I guess if I flipped it over, it might have worked okay. I don't know. I didn't really think about it too hard, but yeah, not a big deal. I just put some paint on the inside of it so that there's no metal showing, and I've just got a little bit of excess there that I think I can just grab with a pair of tweezers. Oh, nope, it is. It wants to take, that's actually coming up there. It's not the, where'd we go? It's not the stynel res trying to peel up. It is actually, the stynel res is just going along with the Edward paint that's on there. So clearly we've seen that with severe bending that issue can happen. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to just slide a little bit of thin super glue underneath that and basically just glue that paint back down. And it should be fine because that's going to all be hidden when I put the other portion of the seat belts on top of it, and that's what it'll look like when we come back to it. Okay, after a little bit of wrestling, I am about to wrap this up, and there's a few more points that I want to cover on this. One of the, well, let me just show you. Okay, so this is where I ended up, and it's not, it's not too bad. But you can see I've definitely incurred some penalty points, and those will be easy to fix, but I just thought I'd leave them there so you could see this is, never really a super smooth process. For one thing, that whole belt thing is a little bit crooked, but I don't worry about that because I want my belts to be as natural looking as possible, and, perfectly straight is perfectly rare. So, my issues are just a little bit of glue showing up in a couple of places. I ended up having a major wad of glue underneath that section right there at the top of the seat to hold it in place. The more you can do to shape these things before you put them in, the better off you are, but that's just a challenge. Way easier said than done. I also kept losing the little tails. You can see those two there in the front, and then there's one down there on the lap belt. They just kept wanting to pop off, and that got to be a real hassle. But I think, overall, it's got a nice three-dimensional look, and it's relatively clean. And when I spray some dull coat on there, that will take care of the shiny little glue spots. And if I need a little touch-up paint, then I'll do that. Now, another thing about Spitfire seat belts is that tail sticking out there. Now, what happens with that tail is that it is attached to a couple of cables, and they go to a thing back in the fuselage that is basically a spring-loaded spool. And what it does is it essentially keeps some tension on that shoulder belt so that it stays snug. And it has it's got a quick release on it. Actually, it's on the side of the cockpit, and it's represented by this little thing right here. And in real life, that's got a cable running back from that to back here in the fuselage where that spool is. And so then that way, if the pilot gets in trouble, he pulls the quick release, it releases the cable, the harness comes loose, and he can bail out. Now, with this Edward thing, they've created it pretty accurately, because that's about how far the tail of the straps goes to the rear. And so what I'm going to probably end up doing is just taking a couple of little pieces of really, really fine wire. I've got some 6,000 stainless wire that I think I can add on there and be pretty easy and make that look more realistic. Now there's a little nub sticking up on that cross brace right there that you can see, and what that's for is on the tamiya belts, they give you a longer tail on the belt, and you can see there at the back of it, I think this is the right piece of it. You can see right there at the back of it, it's got a little hole in it, and that hole is what engages the little nub there. So it's a little bit easier to assemble and, you know, make it come out the right length, even though it's not exactly realistic. So that's something to factor into your decision if you're going to, you know, as far as whether or not you're going to use the Tamiya belts or you're going to go aftermarket. The one thing that I've been forgetting to mention is when I did my dry fitting of this instrument panel subassembly and the seat subassembly and this former right here, that they're a little bit tight. You can see that they go down here in these notches. They slide down here into these slots right here. And I ended up having to just open those up a little bit. I opened up the notches with a file, and that worked pretty good and enabled those to just drop right down in there. And so I think here pretty quick, I will have this entire cockpit subassembly squared away. Okay, so before I move on, I want to cover a little bit more about how to actually assemble this Eduard belt set, because Spitfire belts are a little bit tricky, and I did not film how I made that back section. And you see how it's got that loop under there? Okay, let me do a little splaining right now, because the Eduard instructions are not great. And if you've never done this and you're not familiar with these Spitfire seat belts, this will be important. Okay, so when you're looking at these instructions, all right, first of all, do stuff like this with it on the fret. Much easier. Second of all, stuff like this where they want you to add these little tails on here, do that after the main portion of the belt is already stuck to the seat, because not only will it be a lot easier to hold on to everything, but if you try to put these on here now, when you go to forming these over the seat, they're going to start flying off. Trust me, they will not stay. I got lucky that one of these little tails stayed put while I was doing it, but the other one more than made up for it by popping off of there 3 or 4 times. So trust me on that. Form the belts into the seat base and then add these additional little pieces. Okay, now that's kind of an overall thing. You still have to deal with this right here, okay? The deal with these belts, with this Sutton harness, is that you've got this front part and this back part. And what they want you to do is add the two of them together and then add that subassembly to the seat. Same thing with the Tamiya instructions. You can see they're broken up a little bit differently. I think I mentioned that, but nonetheless, what they want you to do is combine those two pieces and then put that whole thing on the seat. And I talked about putting it through that little hole as opposed to draping it over the back of the seat. But there's still a little bit of a trick to how I did that, because I do not recommend doing it the way that they would have you do it. Because, again, if you've got these two pieces glued together and you start trying to form them like this, you're going to have a bad time. They're going to not want to stay put together. It's going to be a shit show. Plus, you may not get everything in the right place. So I recommend putting this part on the seat, forming it, and then adding the big piece. Now, how did I do that? So, let me, I was actually just explaining this to someone on video, so I've got my handy dandy little visual aid right here, okay? So, what you need to do is, if this cartoon represents part 2, all right? Cut it off of the fret. And with the bare metal side facing you, okay, remember, this photo etch stuff is only got paint on the one side. So they give you two of each of 2 types. And by the way, Eduard, screw you guys for being lazy and not telling people why there's 2 different sets of instructions on the front and on the back and why they're different, okay? Because what you've got here is an early seatbelt type and a late seatbelt type. So for this being a Mark Mark II, you need the early type that's got the line of holes in the straps. Okay, now this part right here is the one we're talking about. When you chop that off, okay, the back side of it doesn't have any paint on it, right? So with that side facing you, what I did is I add a little bit of glue right down here to the bottom of it, and then I poke it down into the hole. All right, let's pretend that my tweezers are that Y-shaped thing, and that this is the hole in the back of the seat. This is going to get kind of pornographic right now. Okay, you're going to drop the handle of the fork down into that rectangular shaped hole, and it's going to have glue right here. Okay, so you drop it down in there until that goes just below the lip of the hole, and then press it like that, and now that glue will be mashed up against the back side of the seat where that rectangular hole is. In other words, right back there. Hopefully you can see that, okay? Like that. All right, and so then what you'll be looking at is you'll be looking at the seat like this, and this Y will be there with that unpainted side facing you. Okay, at that point what I did is I took some tan paint that I had mentioned, and I painted this part, this face of it, because look, if you fold it, if you have that there, even when you fold it over like this, there's a good chance you're going to be able to see that part right in there that is going to be shiny, and that'll screw up the look of your belts. So this is the easy time to put a little paint on that. All right, so you got some paint on it, and it's sticking up there with its arms straight up in the air. Then what you do is take a little tiny round thing. Okay, I ended up using the handle of that little bitty Q-tip that I was showing you guys. Oh, here it is. I used the handle of this Q-tip, and I laid it across the seat right about there, or actually a little bit higher up there, right about where I knew the bend needed to be, and I pinched it between my thumb and my forefinger, and then grabbed or pushed on, or whatever you want to call it, each of these individual things. So okay, so I've got the Q-tip handle laying across there, and I'm holding it against the back of the seat. Oh, actually, I should have mentioned, before you do that, put some glue on the back side here and mash it up against the seat back, okay? That will glue this piece in place pretty firmly, but don't count on that super glue to hold it for you when you do this next operation. You still need something to form it over anyway. So you hold the little former, the handle of the Q-tip or whatever, and you're mashing it up against the back of the seat, and then you grab these and wrap them over it and push them as far down as you can. All right, and so now you'll have something like this, and when you take the pressure off, they're gonna still be kind of sticking up in the air, okay? Because this stuff is springy. So they'll be kind of sticking up in the air like that, and there'll be a little bit of space behind them. But what needs to happen is, if you look at the seat, they need to go all the way back down to the surface of the seat base. All right, you can kind of see in there what I'm saying. All right. So again, you use your glue looper, and you reach in under there and put a little drop of glue on it, and then mash it down. Here, we'll do it this way. Here's a Post-it note. And bam, stuck like that. Just like that. And that's now what you'll be looking at. The painted part will be this Y part that you can see on mine as it goes down in between the other belts, down through that little hole. And you can see obviously why I had to paint it, because it ain't going to show, or because it is going to show so much. Now, in theory, you could flip it over and use the other side like I mentioned before, but then you'll have shiny part there at the top of the loop, and you don't want that either. I mean, either way, you're going to have to put some paint on there someplace to do this correctly. Okay, so now that you've got the belts on there and it's all secured down and snug, this should now be pretty firm. Now all you have to do is, and I recommend doing a little bit of the bending, or as much of the bending as possible as you can, to form that tail, that come on, focus, to form that tail that goes back to the rear. And you can see about where the tail ended up being on mine. But form that tail as much as possible. Put a little bit of glue on each of these things here, and then just lay the main shoulder harness thing on top of it. Press it down, maybe use a little kicker, and now you've got it secured in 2 spots right there at the top. And then you can start to these tails, these long tails here will still be sticking up, and you reach under them, put a little bit of thick super glue underneath, and then mash them down and against the seat back, and that'll get everything held in place. And so you can kind of see how I've formed all that down in there. It looks pretty natural, and it's got plenty of glue. If you're worried at all, what I like to do is come in with the glue looper and some thin CA and wick some more underneath the edge of the belt to make sure that there's plenty of super glue under there, because the last thing you want is for this thing a year later to come popping loose and be flapping around in the breeze. So that will get you all 4 of the main parts of the harness in place, and then you can come back and add those little tails that are stuck on there right below the buckles, and then the ones down there on the lap belts. And at that point, you'll be done, and you can take care of all your glue goobers like I had, and with a little bit of dull coat, which I have not done yet. And I actually had a huge glue goober, the one that I mentioned, up there at the top of the seat back, that I had to actually file and remove because it was so gross. So let me talk for a second about tools, because tools, this is one of those jobs where having good tools makes a huge difference in the initial construction, as well as in, unfucking yourself when things go south. So I keep mentioning glue loopers, and I actually just got a brand new set of these in the mail, so you can see these. This is how they come. They are fantastic. Now, the ones that I use the most are the small and the medium. And kind of a key point here, you see it is a loop, hence the name glue looper. Now here is the problem, okay? Let me, I got to do another illustration, okay? Here's the problem. When you dip the loop in the super glue, okay, you can see it here. It's dried on this looper. See, it fills up that loop. And you can also see what I'm about to tell you. The problem is when you've got it as a loop, okay, and you're trying to wick it underneath the edge of something like this seatbelt, okay, what you want to do is touch the edge of the part where it meets the surface that it's glued to. And in order for that glue to get sucked underneath there, that meniscus that's in there has to actually touch the edge of the part. But if it has a loop around it, it can't, okay? Because here you've got the edge of the part, like this is the seat belt, this is the seat, okay? And you want to put some glue in here. Well, here you are with your loop, and this loop is blocking you from touching this fluid against that edge right there and making it go underneath and fill that in. So the reason that my glue looper looks a little different is because I take my Xuron photo etch shears and I cut the end of it to turn it into a little glue tuning fork. See that? It's a little harder to make the glue stay in there initially, but trust me on this, this is a magic trick, because now with the end of that being kind of open, that little meniscus can now touch whatever part you're trying to wick it under, so you can come in at a nice angle and touch the tip like that, and that meniscus will grab hold and it'll just go, and it'll suck it right underneath there. Trust me on this. This is a really good trick. Now what I do is when I keep my thin super glue in the top of one of these things, and if I can't get it to fill and stay in, then I've found that if I just take and wipe it across the top of my finger a little bit and then go back and do it, for whatever reason, then that loop will fill. So, okay, I know that's throwing a lot of information at you guys, but these are the subtle little tricks that can make a big difference in the quality of your craftsmanship. So, at any rate, that's the glue looper part of the tool talk on this. The other thing, let's see, I talked about using these little Q-tips. Oh, how did I take care of the big blob of glue that was right there that I had to file off? You can see where I did that, and I did pretty good. I didn't get into the color coat, didn't even go through the clear coat. And the reason is because my friendly dentist hooking me up with that tiny little carbide burr. And I can just very, very carefully reach in there with what seems like a gigantic tool and file off that little blob. But that's an extreme case, and you really, really don't want to have to do that kind of thing. What you hope to do instead, if you've got a little blob, like I had a blob of glue on top of this belt right here, right there on top of that one that kept coming out. I've got stupid and put too much glue on it when I kept sticking it back in there for the 38th time. Okay, that's where this stuff right here becomes your secret weapon. All right, there's a lot of different types of super glue debonder. They're all, there seem to be, like a lot of things, various recipes. Pure acetone allegedly will remove super glue, but it'll also remove paint and polystyrene, and you obviously don't want that. This stuff, whatever it is fantastic because it does not dissolve polystyrene. It will eat your paint, however, and pretty much any kind of paint. So, in a situation like this, you have to be super careful with it. But the good news is that it does not eat the paint that they use to paint the pre-painted seatbelts. So you can clean up glue on top of those. You just have to be really careful not to, get over into the actual paint, or you'll be fixing another problem. But the thing with that debonder is that it turns the super glue into super goo. It turns it into just kind of this goopy sludge, and you just sort of have to keep working it with I have a little tiny scrap paintbrush that I use for it. And what you do is you put a little debonder on the brush, you work the area, wipe it off on a napkin or something, get some more debonder on there, rinse it out as best you can, go back and work the glue joint a little bit more, and it's gradual. You have to keep scrubbing and working and scrubbing and working, but eventually you will get all that super goo off of there, and you'll be good to go. And then make sure and rinse your brush out in the debonder, or the next time you go to use it, it'll be all stiffened up with glue. So anyhow, that is the end of all of that seatbelt installation, and you can see that we are just about done. Okay, so just to wrap things up, here's a quick look at the completed interior of this little thing. So I've gone ahead and attached the cockpit tub to one side of the fuselage, and you can see the wire that I used for the cables on the harness. And what that is it's really neat. It's like 2.5 thousandths diameter wire that I got from the vaping supply guys, and it is actual like a nickel chromium wire, and I guess they use it to make heating elements, but it's the finest wire that I've been able to find, and it's easy to form. It's pretty malleable, and you can see I just super glued it in there. So that's a great thing to have in your detail wiring stash. But anyhow, I'm overall pretty pleased with the way this cockpit turned out. It was a lot of work, but it was a lot of fun, and even though pretty much most of it is not going to be visible when it's all said and done, I feel like it was a good exercise and a good, certainly a good workout in terms of technique, because I mostly work in 1/32nd, and doing this little thing at 1/48th was definitely a skill test. So, and hopefully you guys found the instruction useful. Okay, so there you go. Like I said, long, painful. So just another normal video for me. One thing I did forget to mention that I think is useful is for mashing down photo etch, forming photo etch, and also for forming detail wire. One thing I really like are these silicone sculpting tools. Can't really call them brushes, although you can see they are kind of flexible, but you get them in a set and they're cheap, and they come in a variety of shapes. So you can always find one that works well for any given situation. But I really like these because they are flexible, so they won't screw up your paint and whatever. So a very useful tool to have in your arsenal. Anyway, let's wrap this thing up and move on. Next episode things are gonna start to move pretty quickly, because I'm gonna have probably most of the fuselage and wing assembled, and it won't be long before this thing gets into some serious external paint. All right, if you guys have continued to watch, I really appreciate it, and as always, much love.